have a look inside yourself. Please like, share, and subscribe. No self, no suffering. The Buddha. Join us for a short story. In the garden of an old ancient city, under the shadow of a grand temple, two characters meet by chance. A young monk, Tenzin, with an inquisitive mind, and an old gardener, Maya, who has seen the world change many times over. What brings you to this sacred place, young monk? Maya asked, her voice soft but clear. I seek to understand the Buddha, to really know who he was, Tenzin replied, his eyes reflecting a quest for deep knowledge. Ah, the Buddha. He was a prince who renounced his throne in search of truth, Maya began, her hands expertly trimming a bush as she spoke. The conversation meandered through the life of the Buddha, exploring his teachings and the impact he had on the world. Tenzin listened intently, absorbing every word. Maya spoke not just of historical facts, but wove in metaphors and similes that made the Buddha's journey come alive. As the sun began to set, Maya paused, looking at Tenzin. But remember, young monk, the Buddha's story is not just in the past. It's in every act of kindness, every moment of understanding. Tenzin nodded thoughtfully. True, Maya. His teachings are timeless, but I still wonder, how did he feel in those moments of solitude and meditation? Ah, that is a question that leads to many paths, Maya said with a knowing smile. Perhaps it's a question best answered through your own journey. As the night fell, their conversation took on an air of mystery, delving into the Buddha's meditative experiences, the nature of enlightenment, the paradoxes of life and suffering. The garden around them seemed to come alive, as if echoing the profundity of their dialogue. Life is a constant flow of change, much like this garden, Maya mused, gazing at the moonlit flowers. The Buddha embraced this change and found peace. Maybe that's the greatest lesson he left us. Tenzin nodded, lost in thought. Change. I suppose that's the only constant in life. Their conversation continued, each sentence building upon the last, creating a tapestry of ideas and stories that seemed to transcend time and space. The story of the Buddha, as told by Maya, was not just a historical account, but a living, breathing narrative that challenged Tenzin to think deeply and critically. As the moon climbed higher, Tenzin finally stood up, bowing respectfully to Maya. Thank you for your wisdom, Maya. I have much to reflect upon. Maya smiled. The pleasure is mine, Tenzin. Remember, the story of the Buddha is never-ending, just like our journey in this life. Tenzin walked away, his mind brimming with questions and insights. And in the garden, under the serene gaze of the moon, Maya continued her work, humming an ancient melody that seemed as timeless as the story they had just shared. Wowzers. What an enlightened story. Slight tug on the heartstring, hey? Hit that like button! The Buddha made a big promise, that if we know the cause of suffering, we can end it. Buddhism famously says that everything we are looking for, happiness, the end of suffering, even enlightenment, is found right here in this life. Chop wood, carry water and all that. But what is this life? It may be much vaster and deeper than we think, both less real and more real. And perhaps more importantly, what is it not? Because according to Buddhism, the whole problem is that we misunderstand the true nature of this life. The Buddha said we make some fundamental cognitive errors about who we are and what we experience. And these cause our suffering. Looking at it that way, the whole Buddhist path is nothing but a way to get from who and where we think we are to who and where we really are. The Buddha's teaching on this path and the insights behind it are summarized in 4 simple statements. These 4 truths are called noble because they liberate us from suffering. 1. Our lives are pervaded by suffering, both obvious and subtle. 2. There is an identifiable cause of our suffering. 3. Because we know its cause, we can free ourselves from suffering. 4. There is a specific path we can follow to end suffering, which consists of meditation, wisdom, and ethical living. Experiencing interbeing leads us toward the ultimate, unconditioned aspect of our true nature, one we could describe as enlightened. What is this false sense of self? What is often called ego? It's the mistaken belief that we are a separate, independent entity with some sort of unchanging personal essence at our core. This self doesn't exist. It's a fiction we create based on our ignorance about the true nature of ourselves and reality. But because we believe this self exists, we struggle to serve and protect it, and cause ourselves and others endless suffering in the process. It is the false organizing principle of our lives. Who then are we really? One thing we can say with certainty is that in our true self there is no hint of the mistaken or fictitious self. All phenomena, including us, are the products of infinite causes and conditions. There is nothing that is separate or independent. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, everything in the universe is present in a single flower, and in us, except one thing: a separate self. This is very good news. When we realize that we are interdependent with all things, we see we are not separate from anything or in conflict with reality. This is our true nature, what Thich Nhat Hanh called inner being, in the relative realm of phenomena. Experiencing it leads us toward the ultimate, unconditioned aspect of our true nature, one we could describe as enlightened. We might give it a name like Buddha nature, or describe some of its characteristics, such as wisdom, compassion, and awareness. But Buddhists are leery about talking too much about that because we have a tendency to grasp onto such appealing concepts and solidify them into yet another, more spiritual version of ego. That's why Buddhists generally prefer to focus on understanding where we're going wrong, because there's less risk that will inflate our ego. Reality will naturally reveal itself when ignorance is cleared away, so we don't have to think too far ahead. There's a concept in Buddhism called the two benefits. It means anything we do that is positive, that is virtuous, benefits both ourselves and others. It is only the mistaken self's narrow and superficial definition of self-interest that makes us think we have to choose between our well-being and others. When we know what truly makes us happy, things like a loving connection to others and living a meaningful life, then there is no conflict. What helps me helps you, and vice versa. My real happiness and yours are not separate. And it turns out that one of the very best things we can do for others is to be happy and whole ourselves. When we are not driven by our small, mistaken sense of who we are skillful, resilient, and caring, and we radiate love and joy. We show others that happiness is possible. By practicing these four truths, we diminish suffering not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. The truth of suffering. The Buddha said that life is marked by dukkha. It's usually translated as suffering. It can also mean struggle. In fact, the Buddha defined nirvana, the end of suffering, as the total absence of struggle, complete peace. We often say that life is a struggle. What that really means is that it's a never-ending struggle to maintain our sense of ourselves as separate, independent, and at some level permanent. That's a painful and futile struggle because it flies in the face of the most fundamental qualities of reality, change and impermanence. As the Buddha famously said, all compounded phenomena disintegrate. That includes us. Nothing in life is solid and everything is always changing. There is nothing we can hold on to. Everything is impermanent and dies, and yet we try, endlessly. Moment after moment, we struggle to create a solid sense of ourselves, which inevitably changes and disintegrates and must be recreated. This endless process of creation, disintegration, and recreation, which gives us the illusion of a continuous self. It's what is known in Buddhism as samsara, the realm of struggle and suffering we are caught in. At some level, we know there is no solid self we can rely on. We know deep down that our existence is questionable. And so our lives are marked by a subtle, underlying fear of emptiness and non-existence. We are right. We don't really exist, at least not in the way we think we do. The other way we try to maintain the mistaken self is to build around it a solid world we can depend on, one whose existence confirms our own existence. But this too is impossible because of change and impermanence, and so it leads to all kinds of other suffering. As the Buddha said, all meeting ends in parting. We will inevitably lose what we treasure and love. That's heartbreaking. Equally heartbreaking, we will inevitably suffer bad and painful experiences we don't want. And no matter what, we will lose everything in the end because we will die. In a real sense, this whole mistaken self and the whole mistaken world we create to confirm it is nothing but an attempt to deny the reality of death. Buddhism traditionally categorizes suffering in these three ways: losing what we want, getting what we don't want, and our underlying feelings of fear and unease. This is suffering we cause ourselves by our denial of reality. Buddhism teaches us ways to develop the wisdom to free ourselves from it. But there is another kind of suffering we need to add: the suffering caused by other people and their egos. I don't need to catalog all the terrible ways people treat each other. You know them as well I do. In our personal lives, in the family, relationships, workplaces. People make us suffer and we make them suffer. And it is Buddhism's contribution to the modern world, because the Four Noble Truths help us better understand these forms of suffering and how to alleviate them. The cause of suffering. According to the Buddha, the basic cause of suffering is ignorance, our fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of ourselves and reality. Ego is at root concerned with only one thing: itself. Protecting itself, maintaining itself, pleasing itself. As the Dalai Lama famously said, we all feel we're the most important thing in the world. So with the care and feeding of the self as the organizing principle of our lives, we generate what are known in Buddhism as the three poisons. We divide the world into three categories: good for me, bad for me. It doesn't affect me. We categorize everything according to what it means to us and act accordingly. So if there's something I like, something good for me, try to attract or consume it. This is the poison of passion, greed, or attachment. On the other hand, if there's something bad for me, something that's painful or threatens my existence, I try to repel or attack it. This is the poison of anger or aggression. Finally, if there's something or somebody that doesn't affect me, that's irrelevant to my well-being, then I ignore them. This is the poison of indifference. These poisons metastasize into endless dualisms by which we categorize everything as either good for me or bad for me. Traditionally, these are called the 8 worldly concerns, and they're ego's guide to life. Happiness versus suffering, fame versus insignificance, praise versus blame, and gain versus loss. But of course, there are infinite variations. Winning versus losing, rich versus poor, liked versus disliked, beautiful versus ugly, successful versus unsuccessful, and on and on. It's a good exercise to make your own list of what you feel is good for you versus bad for you. It's not that these dualisms are necessarily a problem in themselves. There are things that are good in this world, and we shouldn't seek out suffering. The problem is that this process is totally self-centered. It's the me part. Focused on ourselves, we're less caring about others. Driven by these dualisms, we are consumed by hope and fear. We hope to get the good stuff and fear getting the bad stuff. The whole struggle produces nothing but stress and suffering. And for what? Temporary gratification of a non-existent self. Greed, aggression, and indifference don't just poison our own lives. They also poison society. They may start with us as individuals, but they manifest on a massive scale in our political and economic systems. Greed manifests in rapacious corporations and massive inequality. Aggression manifests in war, oppression, and ideologies of superiority. Indifference manifests in uncaring societies that allow millions to suffer poverty and deprivation. All 3 poisons manifest in our relationship with the earth, threatening our very future. Ego also goes beyond the individual. In fact, its most damaging form may be collective ego, the larger selves many people identify with. My race, my country, my party, my religion, my gender, my class, etc. The end of suffering. Since we are creating this tragedy ourselves, we have the power to free ourselves from it, to renounce our damaging false sense of self, to cultivate all that is good in us, to see reality clearly and live in harmony with it. And because we can do this in our own lives, we can do it in society. It's said in Buddhism that our ignorance and obscurations are merely temporary, and that our true nature is what is real and always present. Our enlightened nature, our natural wisdom and loving heart, is like the sun. It's always there, shining. It's just temporarily obscured by the clouds of ignorance. They make us feel safe, as opposed to the brilliance and openness of the sun in the open sky, which ego finds threatening. That's why we have to go through all the analysis of the first and second noble truths, so we understand how damaging these obscurations are. But once we see the suffering they cause and we're ready to renounce them, there's a proven path we can follow to see the sun. The path. The Buddha's 4th noble truth is the path to the end of suffering, also known as enlightenment. It is our roadmap not only to helping ourselves, but to benefiting others and creating a good society. The path is divided into 8 parts, but they come down to 3 things: meditation, right mindfulness, effort, and concentration; wisdom, right view and thought; and ethical living, right action, speech, and livelihood. Meditation. It begins, of course, with classical Buddhist meditation. We calm and stabilize the mind and then use the power of our focused mind to examine reality and develop insight into its true nature. This 2-step process of developing concentration and insight is unique to Buddhism and is the secret to liberation. But we can also include meditations to open the heart and develop love and compassion, such as metta and tonglen. And the largest number of Buddhists in the world, in the faith-based traditions, focus on the practice of prayer to receive the wisdom and compassion of enlightened beings. So maybe we could call this category spiritual practice rather than just meditation. Today, we understand the damage and trauma that happen in childhood, how we suffer from them for the rest of our lives, and how we pass the suffering on to future generations. To help us heal now and break the cycle of suffering, even long-time meditators find modern psychology helpful, particularly when combined with mindfulness practice. It has a unique power to bring trauma and its origins to the light of awareness, which is the real healing power in this world. Combining modern psychology and timeless Buddhist practice is a new and powerful way to identify much suffering, its cause, and its cure. Wisdom. If, as the Buddha said, our fundamental problem is ignorance, the cognitive errors about our own nature and the nature of reality that cause our suffering. And the real antidote is wisdom. That's why Buddhism is described as the religion of wisdom, because we end the suffering caused by ignorance by correctly understanding our own nature and reality. Wisdom is the antidote not only to the suffering of the individual ego, but to the terrible damage done by collective ego. It helps us to see the unreality of both. Through wisdom, we see that things are not solid, separate, and independent. We see that everything is interdependent, open, fluid, always changing, and good. Our true nature is ethical as well as wise and compassionate. No longer obsessed with ourselves, we naturally act in the world with love and skill, living, speaking, and working in ways that bring benefit and cause no harm. And yet it can happen in a moment. The sun of our true nature is always there, shining. There are moments when it stops or falls apart, and if we're paying attention, we get glimpses of the sunlight breaking through. So the path is both immediate and gradual. The immediate part is that awakened mind is available to us in the present. In ordinary moments like this one, we can experience it right now if we look. More and more we see the sun of our true nature, wisdom, love, and joy, shining through. And in those moments suffering ends, no mistaken self, and the true self revealed in that moment are the ultimate help for both self and others. We have finally come home. Well, that's all, folks. Stay safe until the next video. In the meantime, and as always, leave a comment or two and letting us know what you think. Embark on a literary excavation. Unearth the gems hidden in our description below, where Meg Digital AI meets the intriguing world of Zen FBA books. Bring a shovel, your sense of humor, and a thirst for discovery. Hit the road with us. Flash your thumb with a like and subscribe to ride along on our next adventure. Thank you for watching. Have a look inside. For great gadgets and gifts, visit megdigital.com.
Sensei! Sensei! Sensei!